On a sweltering August morning in 1847 at the Montgomery, Alabama slave market, something strange happened. A man was brought to the auction block who was, by every account, one of the most physically impressive enslaved men anyone had seen in years. He stood 6 feet 3 inches tall, with what the auctioneer described as prime physical condition, exceptional strength, and remarkable countenance. He was 28 years old in perfect health, with no visible scars or defects. In any normal auction, such a man would have plantation owners fighting each other to bid, driving the price into thousands of dollars. But as the bidding began, something went wrong. The price climbed to $200, then $300, then $400, and then it stopped. Plantation owners who had been preparing to bid suddenly went silent. Some whispered to each other and shook their heads. Others actually stepped back from the auction platform. The auctioneer, confused and increasingly frustrated, kept calling for higher bids. Finally, one plantation owner shouted from the crowd, "You'd have to be mad or ignorant to buy that one." The crowd murmured in agreement. That's when Charlotte Whitfield, a widow who had inherited her husband's plantation 6 months earlier, raised her hand and bid $500. The crowd turned to stare at her. The auctioneer accepted, clearly relieved to make any sale at all. And as Charlotte walked forward to complete the transaction, an elderly plantation owner approached her and said quietly, "Mrs. Whitfield, you've just bought the most dangerous slave in Alabama. That's Isaac, and he's killed 4 masters in 5 years." This is the story of what happened when a plantation widow bought the handsomest slave no one wanted, and how their relationship exposed the most terrifying truth about slavery, that some people simply could not be broken no matter what was done to them. Before we begin, I need to warn you, this story contains descriptions of violence, psychological manipulation, abuse, and death. This is documented history that reveals uncomfortable truths about power, resistance, and the impossible choices people made under slavery. If you're ready, stay with me. Charlotte Whitfield was 34 years old when her husband, Samuel Whitfield, died of yellow fever in February 1847. They had been married for 12 years and had no children. Samuel had owned a mid-sized cotton plantation about 15 miles outside Montgomery, with 43 enslaved workers and moderate profitability. When he died, Charlotte inherited everything: the land, the house, the debts, and the people. In 1847 Alabama, a woman managing a plantation alone was unusual but not unheard of. What made Charlotte different was that she had never wanted to be a plantation owner. She had grown up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a merchant family with abolitionist sympathies. She had married Samuel when she was 22, believing his promises that he was a humane slave owner, that his plantation was different, that enslaved people under his care were treated well. She learned quickly that these were lies people told themselves to sleep at night. By the time Samuel died, Charlotte was trapped. She couldn't free the enslaved people without destroying herself financially, and facing legal prosecution. Alabama law severely restricted manumission. She couldn't sell the plantation without her husband's family's approval, and they refused. She couldn't run it without labor, and that labor was enslaved people. So she did what she thought was the least harmful thing. She decided to run the plantation herself, with rules that she believed would minimize cruelty. No whippings without her explicit approval. No separation of families. No sexual exploitation. Adequate food and medical care. Her overseers hated it. Her neighbors mocked her. But Charlotte didn't care. She had inherited a nightmare, and she was determined to make it less nightmarish if she couldn't escape it entirely. In August of 1847, Charlotte needed additional workers because several enslaved men had died during a cholera outbreak. She went to the Montgomery slave market with her head overseer, a man named Thomas Brennan, who had worked for her husband for 10 years. That's where she saw Isaac. Isaac was unlike anyone Charlotte had ever seen on an auction block. Most enslaved people at auction showed signs of trauma: vacant stares, visible scars, malnourishment, resignation. Isaac stood perfectly upright, looked directly at the crowd with what could only be described as contempt, and radiated an energy that was simultaneously magnetic and terrifying. When the auctioneer tried to make him turn around to display his physique, Isaac moved slowly, deliberately, as if he was choosing to comply rather than being forced. Charlotte noticed immediately that something was wrong. Men who looked like Isaac, young, strong, healthy, should have sold for $1,500 or more, but the bidding stalled. She asked Thomas Brennan what was happening. He pulled her aside and told her the rumors. Isaac had been sold 5 times in 5 years. His first owner, a plantation owner in Georgia, had purchased him in 1842. 6 months later, that owner was found dead in his barn, his skull crushed by a shovel. There was no proof, but everyone suspected Isaac. He was sold to a second owner in South Carolina. That man died 2 years later when his horse mysteriously threw him, breaking his neck. Isaac was sold again. The third owner, a notorious brutal overseer who had bought Isaac specifically to break him, was found drowned in a creek in 1845, again no proof. Isaac was sold to a fourth owner, a wealthy planter in Mississippi who decided to use Isaac for breeding and forced him with multiple enslaved women. That owner died in his sleep in 1846. The doctor ruled it a heart attack, but there was speculation about poison. 4 owners, 4 deaths, 5 years, no convictions, no proof. But a pattern that terrified every slave owner in the region. Isaac had been passed from auction to auction, each time with a lower price, because no one wanted to be the 5th dead master. Thomas Brennan begged Charlotte not to bid. He told her that Isaac was cursed, that he was a killer, that bringing him to the plantation would endanger everyone. Charlotte listened to everything he said, and then she bid anyway. When they asked her why, years later, Charlotte said something remarkable. She said, "I looked at Isaac, and I saw a man who had decided he would rather die than be a slave, and I thought, if I could make him see that I was not his enemy, perhaps he would not kill me. And if I could not, perhaps I deserved what the others had gotten." Charlotte bought Isaac for $500, a fraction of his actual value. She signed the papers and Isaac was legally hers. On the wagon ride back to the plantation, Thomas Brennan sat as far from Isaac as possible, his hand on his pistol. Charlotte sat directly across from Isaac and spoke to him. She told him her name. She told him she knew his history. She told him that she did not believe in slavery, that she was trapped in a system she hated, and that she would not abuse him. Isaac said nothing. He just watched her with those unreadable eyes. For the first month, Isaac worked in the fields like every other enslaved man on the plantation. He was assigned to a cabin with 3 other men. He was given the same food, the same clothing, the same brutal routine. But Charlotte made one unusual decision. She told Thomas Brennan and the other overseer that they were never, under any circumstances, to physically discipline Isaac. If he caused problems, they were to report directly to her. The other enslaved people on the plantation knew who Isaac was. Word traveled fast in the enslaved community. Some were terrified of him. Others saw him as a kind of folk hero, a man who had killed masters and survived. Isaac largely kept to himself, working efficiently but speaking to no one. 6 weeks after Isaac arrived, Thomas Brennan ignored Charlotte's orders. He caught Isaac taking extra water during a work break, a minor infraction that overseers usually punished with a whipping. Brennan raised his whip. Isaac grabbed it mid-swing, pulled Brennan close, and said something quietly that no one else could hear. Brennan went pale, stumbled backward, and never touched Isaac again. When Charlotte asked what Isaac had said, Brennan refused to tell her. But everyone noticed that Brennan started avoiding Isaac entirely, even changing his patrol routes to stay away from wherever. Isaac was working 3 months into Isaac's time at the Whitfield plantation. Something extraordinary happened. Charlotte became seriously ill with pneumonia. For 2 weeks, she was bedridden, unable to manage the plantation. Thomas Brennan assumed control and immediately reverted to brutal practices, public whippings, reduced food rations, threats. The plantation descended into the kind of cruelty that Charlotte had been trying to prevent. On the 3rd day of Brennan's reign, Isaac stopped working. He walked off the field in the middle of the day, walked straight to the overseer's office, and told Brennan that if he whipped anyone else, he would die. Brennan pulled his pistol. Isaac didn't move. He just stared at Brennan and said, "You can shoot me, but you'll be dead within a week. And you know it." Brennan didn't shoot. Later, he claimed he should have, that he was a fool. But in that moment, looking at Isaac's absolute certainty, he believed him. The whipping stopped. When Charlotte recovered and learned what had happened, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She fired Thomas Brennan and made Isaac her head overseer. It was unprecedented. A woman plantation owner putting an enslaved man, a man with a reputation for killing masters, in charge of managing other enslaved workers and white overseers. The other plantation owners in the region were horrified. Some threatened to have Isaac arrested on suspicion of the previous murders. Others warned Charlotte that she would be killed. Her husband's family tried to have her declared mentally incompetent and take the plantation away from her. But Charlotte didn't back down. And Isaac, against all expectations, became the most effective overseer the plantation ever had. He didn't use violence. He didn't use fear. He simply organized the work with brutal efficiency, made sure everyone was fed adequately, and enforced Charlotte's rules about no family separations and no sexual exploitation. The plantation's productivity actually increased. Here's what Charlotte wrote in her private journal, discovered over 100 years later: "Isaac does not obey me because I own him. He obeys me because I have shown him that I will not abuse the power I hold over him. It is not loyalty. It is not affection. It is a mutual understanding that we are both trapped in an evil system, and we can make it slightly less evil together. He terrifies me, but I also trust him in ways I have never trusted anyone. For 3 years, this bizarre arrangement continued. Isaac managed the plantation. Charlotte ran the business. They spoke daily, planning operations, discussing problems. Rumors spread that they were having an affair, an accusation that could have gotten both of them killed. There's no evidence that was true. What they had was something more complex and perhaps more transgressive, a relationship built on mutual recognition of each other's humanity in a system designed to deny exactly that. In May of 1850, everything collapsed. Alabama passed stricter slave codes in response to growing abolitionist pressure. One of the new laws required that all enslaved people in positions of authority over white workers be immediately removed from those positions. Charlotte was ordered to demote Isaac and hire a white overseer. She refused. The county sheriff arrived with a warrant to arrest her for violation of slave codes. Isaac made a choice. He ran. He disappeared from the plantation on the night before the sheriff arrived. He left no note, no message. He was simply gone. Charlotte was arrested anyway and spent 2 months in jail before her husband's family paid a fine and secured her release on the condition that she sell the plantation. She agreed. The plantation was sold in July 1850. Charlotte moved back to Philadelphia, where she lived for another 34 years, dying in 1884. Isaac's fate is uncertain. There are unconfirmed reports of a man matching his description who made it to Canada via the Underground Railroad in 1851. There are other reports of a resistance fighter in Alabama who helped enslave people escape and reportedly killed 2 slave catchers in 1852. None of these reports were ever verified. What is certain is that Isaac was never captured, never returned to slavery, and never appeared in any official records after May 1850. So how do we know this story? Charlotte Whitfield kept detailed journals throughout her life, including her years managing the plantation. After her death, her niece inherited them and donated them to the Pennsylvania Historical Society in 1891, where they sat largely unread until 1967. A historian named Dr. Rachel Howard was researching women plantation managers and discovered Charlotte's journals. The entries about Isaac were so extraordinary that Dr. Howard spent the next 5 years verifying them through Alabama plantation records, court documents, and testimony from descendants of enslaved people who had lived on the Whitfield plantation. Howard published her findings in 1973 in a book titled The Widow and the Unbreakable Man, Race, Power, and Resistance in Antebellum Alabama. The book was controversial. Some historians questioned whether Isaac really had killed previous owners or if these were just rumors. Others argued that Charlotte's journals were self-serving, written to make herself look sympathetic. But the core facts were undeniable. A widow plantation owner did place an enslaved man with a terrifying reputation in charge of her plantation, and they did maintain that arrangement for 3 years despite enormous social and legal pressure. The story of Charlotte and Isaac reveals something that makes many people uncomfortable: that humanity could exist even within the evil system of slavery, but that humanity was always constrained, always complicated, always insufficient to overcome the fundamental horror of owning another person. Charlotte believed she was being humane. Isaac made strategic choices to survive. Neither of them could escape the fact that she owned him, that she could sell him or have him killed at any moment, that their entire relationship existed within a structure of absolute power imbalance. Isaac was not bought by other plantation owners because he represented their greatest fear: a slave who could not be broken, who would kill rather than submit, who retained his sense of self no matter what was done to him. Charlotte bought him anyway, and in doing so, she entered into a relationship that neither of them fully controlled, that defied every rule of the system they existed within, and that ultimately could not survive the legal machinery of slavery. Was Isaac really a killer? We'll never know for certain, but what we do know is that 4 men who owned him died under suspicious circumstances, that no one could ever prove he was responsible, and that he lived as a free man after escaping. We also know that during the 3 years he worked for Charlotte Whitfield, no one died. One was seriously harmed, and the plantation operated more humanely than most in Alabama. This is why we tell these stories, because they're complicated. Because they challenge simple narratives, because they reveal that even within the absolute evil of slavery, people made choices, some heroic, some strategic, some morally ambiguous, and those choices mattered. If this story challenged what you thought you knew about slavery, good. That's what Buried History should do. Subscribe to Buried Truths for more stories that refuse to be simple. Comment below: was Isaac a resistance hero, a survivor, or something else entirely? And what do you think really happened to those 4 previous owners? Share this video with someone who needs to understand that history is never just black and white. The truth is buried, but we keep digging.